Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. The results of the British election have come in and it's a surprising outcome. The polls have been proved wrong, Labour has suffered serious setbacks, the Scottish Nationalists have swept Scotland, but most surprisingly of all, the Tories have a majority of their own. Over the next 1 hour, we shall analyse what this result means for David Cameron, Ed Miliband and Nick Clegg, what sort of government Mr Cameron will form, and what sort of relationship the Tories will have with Scotland. I have with me a special panel of guests, and together we shall answer all the key questions that could come to your mind. And now joining me to discuss and analyse the British election results is the former head of the BBC in India, Sir Mark Tully, the South Asia Chief of Bureau of The Economist, Adam Roberts, the South Asia Editor of The Telegraph, Dean Nelson, and joining us from London, the Managing Editor of The Financial Times, James Lamont, and Professor of Journalism and former Saturday Editor of The Times, George Brock. Adam Roberts, last night the polls predicted almost uniformly that the Tories and Labour were coming in with a dead heat and the Tories wouldn't get more than 280 or 290 seats. Today, the Conservatives have a small majority of their own and they've done significantly better than 2010. So would it be right to say that whatever else this election may be, it is a victory for David Cameron and the Conservatives?
It's a loss for the opinion polls, for the people who try to predict with great confidence what the outcome would be. It was a commonplace thing to say before the election that we'd have to have a coalition government in Britain, and instead, quite remarkably, the Conservatives have come back with a small but probably workable majority. David Cameron must be delighted. His authority is enhanced. He's a very, very lucky man. A man who ran a campaign that was not seen to be tremendously successful or effective, and yet he's come back with a remarkably good result.
George Brock, to what extent was Labour hit by a double Scottish whammy? They were wiped out north of the border by the Scottish Nationalist Party, and in England and Wales, fear that they could ally with the SNP led to them losing rather than gaining seats. Would you agree with that analysis?
Yes, I think it is right. Jim Murphy, the leader of the Labour Party in Scotland, who lost his seat in the wipeout, said that Labour had been hit by two nationalisms, by which he meant Scottish nationalism and English nationalism. Now, whether they'd really been hit by English nationalism is a bit debatable, but it is absolutely without dispute that they were crushed by a new version, if you like, of Scottish nationalism, yes.
So, Mark, would you say that the Conservative campaign that said that a Labour-SNP alliance will be an alliance between a party that wants to break the country and another party that wants to break the bank eventually resonated, or at least frightened, the voters south of the border?
Well, I think both those issues were obviously ones which played more than people had analysed. The idea that the economy was on the way up at last, that it had been reasonably well managed by the Conservatives, and that the Labour would go back to what many people see as the dark days of Gordon Brown, last Gordon Brown, and the last days of Tony Blair. So that was one side of it, and also, of course, as you say, the other side of it was the fear that Labour, although they said they wouldn't, Miliband categorically said he would not ally with the Scottish Nationalists, there was a fear, obviously, that he would do.
James Lamont, when he won, Alex Salmond, the Scottish National Party leader, said that the Scottish lion had roared in Scotland. What did that roar feel like to people in England and Wales?
Well, essentially what you have in Scotland now is a nationalist monopoly. And it is an extraordinary story, this sort of spectacular rise of the SNP taking almost all the seats in Scotland. I mean, it is a really seismic change north of the border. I think that we're yet to see what the roar sounds like, but I think that in terms of the voting intentions in Scotland, Scots were not voting for independence or necessarily for another referendum, and Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon have made that clear in their statements over the last few days. However, what they are voting for is legislation and Scottish interests, and rather than separatism. But I wouldn't be surprised with a Scottish election coming up in 2016, that we don't see referendum, a second referendum, back in the manifesto. One of the big challenges that David Cameron now has, he'll have a day of self-satisfaction today, but there's some fairly existential questions he now has to grapple with. One is keeping the union together and the balance of power in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. But also the UK's relationship with Europe, because part of his manifesto was pledging a referendum on the UK's EU membership.
James has given us an encyclopedic answer that's actually touched on many things that I want to raise one by one later on. Let me for a moment focus a little bit more on what Nicola Sturgeon called the tectonic shift that's happened in Scotland. I noticed that in some constituencies like Glasgow, the SNP actually saw a 39% swing in its favour, which is almost unprecedented, and they've had turnouts of up to 75%. Would you accept that this means that the party's hold on Scotland is not just dominant, but it's likely to be around for a long while?
I think she's called it exactly right. I mean, to get a sense of, you know, the impact of what this really means in Scotland, is that Glasgow is the cradle of Labour, not just the cradle of Scottish Labour. It's the Labour Party was born on the Clyde. It was a Scottish party. The central belt of Scotland between Glasgow and Edinburgh was a Labour establishment. Scotland never had a Tory establishment, and so, you know, it's the end of Labour in Scotland, and you know, although
when you say the end of Labour, do you mean the end of Labour for the foreseeable future, or are you actually saying forever?
Absolutely. Well, for the foreseeable future, because you've seen, you know, big beast MPs, you know, like Jim Murphy, you know, lose Douglas Alexander, you know, big Lib Dems lose their seats too. You've seen, you know, the dismay among all those activists that work to bring them back to power, and the fight now. Labour has no longer has skin in the fight. The fight is between a landslide in Scotland against austerity and an English majority in favour of austerity.
But let's come to that later, because that's going to be an issue that I want to discuss with you in part two when I talk about the challenges that Cameron faces, but now that he has to handle a country that's effectively divided. Let's come to another aspect, Adam Roberts, of this result. Not only has Scotland become what effectively looks like a one-party region, but it seems also that south of the border, the Tories actually dominate. They actually have got a full majority entirely on the basis of the seats they've won in England and Wales. Does that mean that their perspective too will be affected hereafter?
We'll have to go through and analyse exactly where they got their votes, but it's intriguing to see how many votes, for example, UKIP managed to scoop up, around 12%, I think, and yet only made it into one or two MPs. So the Tories have done very, very well in England and very, very badly elsewhere. That makes them, you know, dominantly an English party. And so if there are measures to come in the next few years that the Welsh, the Northern Irish and the Scots don't like, it'll be hard for David Cameron to have the authority to say that he's speaking on behalf of all the British, of the whole of the United Kingdom.
Will that therefore affect not just his authority, but also his, I suppose, credibility when he speaks on behalf of Britain, or is that just journalistic exaggeration?
I'm not sure that outsiders will press him on it as much as those within Scotland, those within Wales and so on. But I think it does go to the question that Dean just mentioned, others have mentioned, when we come to debating Britain's place in the European Union or Scotland's place within Britain, whether he is a leader who is going to preside over a united, solid, strong country, or a leader who presides over a rather divided country.
George Brock, we've talked about what this election has done to Labour, what it's done to Scotland and the SNP. The other party that's been pretty damagingly affected is UKIP. They've ended up with just one seat. Nigel Farage, their leader and founder, has actually lost his seat. He's now gone on and resigned as well. Is this a sizable setback for UKIP? Or is that just, again, a momentary response because they've done badly today? And are they in a position to build back the support that they've got?
I think when the excitement of analysing the immediate result has gone by, my feeling is that people will see this as a rather better result for UKIP than the total in their rather meagre total in seats shows. I don't know exactly where their vote total has got, but I think they scored in percentage terms about 12 or 13% of the vote, which is pretty much what the polls said they would get. Now, that's a fairly sizable chunk of the vote to end up with just the one MP in the House of Commons. So, firstly, they're going to be quite a powerful voice for some form of electoral reform, eccentric though their ways of putting their arguments occasionally are. And I don't think that they will just fade away or disappear. They will say, there's absolutely no reason why we should. We've got much greater legitimacy than our seat total shows, and I think they will carry on campaigning and be a thorn in the side of the Conservative Party, however well and unexpectedly well it has just done.
To what extent, Mark, do you believe that England is now, or Britain rather, a badly divided country, with Scotland dominated by the SNP, and as I pointed out a moment ago, the Tories effectively winning a full majority without really having to take into account the single Scottish seat they've got. They've got it almost entirely on the basis of seats in England and Wales. So does that make Britain a politically divided society, and does that bring up damaging consequences for governance?
Well, yes, certainly. I think it makes it a divided country, because after all, Scottish nationalists made it clear that they still, their demand is still for independence. And therefore you have a country in which one part of it, as a lot of other people have said, has voted largely for the Conservative Party, another part has voted largely for independence. So yes, of course, it is a very divided country. And how Cameron is going to manage this is very difficult indeed. But one thing he has on his side now, of course, I think, is that because there is no question of him having to accommodate the Scottish nationalists in the sense of in any way needing their support in Parliament or anything, he can be more brutal in dealing with them, but then he would have to take the long-term consequences of that brutality.
James Lamont, something that intrigues people outside Britain in particular is that the Tories and the Lib Dems formed a coalition that lasted from 2010 to 2015. At the end of that coalition, the Tories have benefited hugely. They've now got a majority on their own. But the Lib Dems have been reduced to just 8 seats, having had 57 previously. Why is it that the Tories have benefited from the coalition and the Lib Dems been punished?
Well, this has been absolutely disastrous for the Lib Dems, Liberal Democrats. Nick Clegg stood down earlier. I think they, by their core voters, have been seen to have departed in the coalition from some of their very principled policies and been engulfed by the Tories. And I think you've also seen some of the Lib Dem votes splitting, well, not some, a lot of the Lib Dem votes splitting in the campaign and migrating to Labour or migrating to the Tories and leaving them with very little. I mean, they have had an absolutely calamitous night to go down to 8 seats, and having been a party that was able to essentially stabilise the last government and what we thought as have it playing a good influence on the Conservative Party and reining in some of their more radical instincts, particularly around EU membership, and also helping them moderate some of the fiscal consolidation and not going too far on austerity. But they've come out real losers in this. And again, you know, we've talked about the Labour Party in Scotland being wiped out. You're seeing a really, really disastrous situation for the Lib Dems, where I think they're going to find it very, very hard to come back. But I think coalition, while they were good in coalition, the coalition has been bad for them. And you've seen people like Vince Cable, who I know is known in India and have made several trips during the last government to India, has lost his seat and is now out. And you've seen that across the board. I mean, they have lost something like 4/5 of their electoral seats. It's a really big change, and they're going to find it difficult to come back.
But, you know, in a very real sense, what James's answer does there is to underline the question I put to him. Why is it that having moderated the Tories, having ensured that some of the excesses of the Tory right didn't actually become part of Cameron's policy, The Tories get the benefit and end up with considerably more seats than they had in 2010, and the Lib Dems get punished, because it seems peculiar that one half of the coalition should benefit from the 5 years of coalition government and the other be punished.
Well, I think, I wonder, and we don't know why people have voted the way they did, but Clegg had a particularly bad campaign. Clegg was seen to be the one who was, reneging on, was welshing on many of the agreements and policies that he agreed to.
Do you mean school fees and college fees in particular?
Yeah, and so I think a lot of people, their supporters and marginal Tory supporters saw them as, sort of acting in bad faith. I think Clegg didn't perform well, and suddenly attacking the government that he'd been a part of for 5 years looked very, very bad to voters.
Adam Roberts, I want to take up with you a point that you may have heard George Brock make a moment ago, which is the fact that UKIP has got something like 12% of the vote. They've got a total of some pretty close to 4 million votes, but just 1 seat. On the other hand, I believe the Scottish National Party has somewhere between 7 and 8% of the votes, a total of roughly 1.5 million votes that comes to, but 56 seats. Do you think that thereafter the UKIP demand that this is an unfair voting system, that we need to rethink the first past the post method that we've been using, will actually catch on with the British people, or will it simply be heard and ignored?
I think it's more likely to be heard and ignored. It's rather difficult for the UK Independence Party, which broadly appeals to an older electorate, to those who think that the old British way of doing things is best, to argue that really what needs to happen is radical electoral reform of the sort of thing that Europe and European countries or other countries overseas do. So it's a slightly garbled message for UKIP to come out with, to say we must change and adopt a foreign associated electoral system to benefit this party. On the other hand, Britain does need electoral reform. Clearly this is a skewed result. I've got no particular love for UKIP, but this is a completely skewed outcome, and it doesn't look like a particularly proportional or fair result. So there will be many others, even those who are not UKIP supporters, who may well feel that this sort of outcome, including the one in Scotland, is just not healthy for a democracy.
What about something else, George Brock? Clearly, this whole campaign has turned out to be a bit of a disaster for pollsters and opinion polls. Not only were the opinion polls completely contradicted by the exit poll that came out last night, but the actual outcome is a straight majority for the Tories, which no one had thought was possible. If I'm right, the last time the polls were so horribly wrong was 1992, and that led to serious questions being asked about the methodology and quality of British polling. Do you expect the same sort of questions to be asked now again?
You may take it, Karen, that the post-mortems and the inquests inside the opinion polling companies will have already started. There are 2 possible things that have been happening. Either a lot of voters have chosen their vote, not necessarily changed their mind, but chosen which way to go in the last 24 or 48 hours. The other thing, and these 2 explanations are not mutually incompatible, it's quite likely that both things are happening at once or happened at once. The other thing that happens is that people who are going to vote Tory don't like declaring this to opinion pollsters, and that affects the measurement, the polling measurement of the Tory vote. This is known among the people who, the experts, as the shy Tory issue. So it looks like a combination of shy Tories, possibly quite a lot of undecided people making up their mind at the very last moment and swinging towards the Conservatives, made the opinion polls look pretty silly, and they haven't looked this silly really since a pretty unexpected result, again a Conservative win, back in 1992.
There are some people, George Brock, who say that in fact the polling system or methodology also has a slight inbuilt Labour bias, which has shown up in previous polls in earlier elections. Do you go with that?
There are those claims. I mean, they are always desperate to correct them, of course, if they think they can see a bias. Don't forget that the technique of collection changes. There was a shift, firstly, from face-to-face polling towards telephone polling. That telephone polling is now regarded as a rather old-fashioned way of doing it. A lot of people do it online. There are people who say that either telephone or online has a slight bias one way or the other. I think that they will be very, very keen to make sure this doesn't work. I would also add that quite a lot of the constituency level polls haven't been quite accurate either. They too seem to undercount the Conservative vote. So whatever the kink in the system is, it tends to produce a slightly pro-Labour, slightly anti-Conservative bias, and they will be desperately trying to adjust henceforward.
James Lamont, now that he has a majority of his own, will Cameron be a more powerful Conservative leader? And are the questions that used to be asked about him, particularly from some of his right-wing backbenchers, stilled? Or might he have a bit of a problem handling the right-wing, particularly since he no longer has that cushion of Nick Clegg and the Lib Dems to fob them off with?
Well, the remarks that he made earlier this morning when he won his own seat and when the electoral picture was becoming clearer are very, very telling. The big challenge for Cameron is to deliver on what we call one nation Toryism, where conservatism can appeal to different parts of the UK, but also to people who are not naturally Tory voters. The recovery, the economic recovery in the UK has to work for everyone. Inequality is a big issue here. It's what Ed Miliband principally campaigned on. It didn't have resonance for him, but it's still a big issue here. So Cameron has to address the issue of inequality in the UK. What he also has to do is stabilise the union and work on more powers for Scotland. He has to address what could be a very divisive issue around powers between Scotland and England. After the Scottish referendum, there opened up a debate about English MPs being able to vote exclusively on English issues and excluding Scottish MPs voting on this. Traditionally, this has been one of the big issues about how the UK is governed. And then he's got to prevent his party foundering, as it has in the past, over the issue of Europe.
Okay.
We've seen that before in the 90s and indeed the 80s with Thatcher and Major, just how poisonous the debate about Europe can be in the UK.
Absolutely. That's another wonderful encyclopedic answer. But let me go back to that key question, George Brock, with you. How easy or difficult will it be for Cameron to handle what some consider the fruitcake right-wing backbench element that he's always had in the Conservative Party? Now that he's got an outright majority, will he be able to be more effective in bringing them into line? Or because he no longer has the excuse of Nick Clegg and the Lib Dems, might this be a problem for him?
Every Conservative leader since Margaret Thatcher has had to deal with a troublesome right wing. And Cameron faces two issues on which they are going to be potentially difficult once the extra authority that he will gain, at least for a few weeks or months from the scale of his victory, has evaporated. The first, of course, is Scotland, and the second is Europe. And I think all we can say at the moment is that Cameron is bound to tread very warily, even despite the fact that he is operating with an overall majority. Answering how to the question about the issue that has been posed about Scotland, how to give Scotland some more autonomy without upsetting people in England or indeed in Northern Ireland and Wales, is an extraordinarily hard conundrum, and we really don't know very much about how the government thinks about this. And obviously certain ways he could answer it could give him trouble from the right. Then he is completely committed to a referendum on the EU in 2017. And again, if he attempts to do things which the right don't like, then I think they will surely cause trouble. But don't forget that he embarks on trying to answer these two very, very hard questions for any leader, and certainly for a Conservative leader, with quite an extra boost. Don't forget that in the Parliament 2010 to now, an awful lot of those MPs wandered around the House of Commons saying, "No, Cameron's no good. He just doesn't have it. He can't really cut it as a leader." And he's now done a very surprising thing. He's won an overall majority with all of these people saying, "No, he isn't really any good." So at least he starts. How long it lasts, we don't know. But he starts with quite a strong hand.
You know, Mark Tully, we're saying that he has an outright majority, and no doubt he does, but it is only of about 5 or 6 seats. And that's a very slender majority that can be undermined by illness, by defection, by someone dying. And that sort of thing happened, in fact, to John Major, and very quickly in his 5 years he ran into trouble. Do you see Cameron going the same way with this small majority?
No, I don't think so, because I think John Major was in a very different position, because there was a very, very strong opposition to him within the party. There were people deliberately trying to undermine him. I don't sense, sitting here in India, and one's not always on top of these situations, I certainly don't sense that there is any group within the party who desperately want to undermine Cameron, as there was definitely with poor old John Major.
Now, one of the shadows that's going to fall fairly heavily on the Cameron government is going to be that of the SNP, who virtually control practically every seat bar 3 north of the border. Do you foresee SNP Conservative clashes? Is there a danger, even though Nicola Sturgeon has said that she won't bring up a demand for another referendum immediately, that she might choose to do it as part of her manifesto for the 2017 Scottish election?
This election has been a dream outcome for Scottish nationalism and a nightmare scenario for David Cameron and the Conservatives in terms of saving the Union. Nicola Sturgeon has said this wasn't a referendum, but there's an election in Scotland for the Scottish Parliament next year where a referendum will be a part of their manifesto, and for which they are expected to get another strong majority. So that campaign will be against a terrible backdrop of a landslide against austerity government in Scotland and a majority in England and Wales for austerity. Now, how does David Cameron square that? The SNP and the Tory government will be constantly at loggerheads. The SNP will constantly have an issue, and it's the same issue that gave rise to Scottish nationalism in the first place. It grew under Thatcher's rule throughout the 80s, where Scotland voted Labour and the SNP, but they got Tory Thatcherite government which they didn't support. Now you've got a landslide. No, there's never in Scottish political history been an outcome like this, where Scotland has voted absolutely for one clear thing, anti-austerity, and they're going to get the complete reverse of what they voted for. There is no better scenario for pushing for independence of Scotland.
Would you agree with that, Adam Roberts, that in fact the Scottish question, far from being resolved, is bound to resurrect itself, and possibly in a far worse way than happened last year?
I agree that it's not been resolved. I think there's a decent chance that there'll be a demand for another referendum, and there'll certainly be a debate about this just because of the election result we've just seen. That said, I don't necessarily think we'll be rushing into another referendum very, very soon. Look at the oil price, for example, and how much it's fallen since the referendum last year. It doesn't look coherently possible for Scotland to stand on its own from an economic point of view as an independent country if oil prices are slumping. The sheer number of people who voted in the referendum last year in favour of independence could on their own have produced the electoral result we just had in the general election. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's an extra increase in support for independent Scotland. But the issue, Dean is absolutely right, the issue is still going to be there. It doesn't mean that the outcome is necessarily going to be an independent Scotland in the next 5 years.
James Lamont, the other thing that Cameron is committed to is the referendum on the European Union, but that is going to be predicated upon some form of negotiation that he goes through, and principally he has to negotiate with Angela Merkel. Can he get from the German Chancellor some sort of deal whereby when that referendum is held in England, he can be on the side of saying, vote yes, we want to stay in? Or do you think Merkel will not give him what he wants, thus adding to his problem?
Well, those discussions have not been very encouraging. In the past government, relations with Europe, I think, have not really been terribly successful. I think the Tories have had a strategy of talking to Angela Merkel. That's been the angle that they've taken rather than going for a more pan-European approach. They've thought that they could get support and an answer from her. That hasn't been forthcoming. So I think hopes for a renegotiated treaty that would benefit the UK, I think, are very slim, and I think the patience for that in Europe is low too, and indeed in Berlin. I think if that doesn't work, he said it's either renegotiation or referendum. A referendum heralds a seismic change in the UK's relationship with its chief trading partner, and it would also shift the balance of power within the EU. And if we're looking for big stories on the horizon, we write a lot about Grexit, but now we're also having to seriously consider Brexit, which is Britain's possible exit from the EU. I mean, I think that Cameron will have a job to do to argue possibly that the UK has a place in Europe, not necessarily within the Eurozone, but certainly with the political compact that has maintained European stability since the end of the Second World War.
Very quickly, George Brock, to sum up on those two big challenges facing Cameron, one handling Scotland, the other handling the European Union. And I'll ask you for a quick answer because I then want to move on to what I call the losers. Do you think Cameron's second government could be much more challenging and problematic than the first? Because both the Scotland problem and the European Union problem look pretty implacable at this point of time and heading towards getting worse.
Well, they look pretty tough, but if you think back to 2010, Karen, you will remember that the financial situation was pretty grim in 2010. And in fact, they have managed, to judge by today's results, to convince people that what they did to correct the economy has, broadly speaking, worked at least for enough people to give them a majority. So I don't suppose they're going to be tremendously pessimistic about it, but at the same time, he's got a very, very hard road to hoe, as somebody just explained, James just explained, on Europe, and Scotland is no easier.
Let's come, Mark, to what I call the losers. He's already resigned, Ed Miliband. How will history remember him as leader of the Labour Party? Will he be thought of as the wrong man at the wrong time, unable to rise to the challenge for a variety of reasons? And will some unkind people say that had his brother David been the party leader, it might have been a different outcome?
Well, yes, I think both of those are so. I think that he will be seen as a very short-term figure within the Labour Party, and one who clearly was not able to match up to the task he faced. But I do think one thing about Miliband is that I think that his treatment by the press, which must have had an impact, was really, to put it politely, unusually brutal. I think that has to be taken into account when one assesses his failure, his final failure.
Maybe historians will, the press probably won't.
Dead right there.
What about something else, Dean Nelson? Labour has not just lost their leader, but Douglas Alexander, their shadow foreign secretary, lost the elections. Ed Balls, their shadow chancellor, lost the elections. Are they going to now actually have to skip a generation and reshape themselves with new people who are nowhere near as well known?
Absolutely. I mean, they've lost what has been the collective brains trust of the leadership of the party for the last maybe even 10 years. Douglas Alexander has written the Labour Party manifestos for the last 2 or 3 elections. So it's huge, and I fear that it will reopen the whole Blair-Brown debate, because there's been a lot of anger today, particularly in Scotland, from Blairites blaming Ed Miliband and the leadership for the way that they've not reached out to a broader electorate through pursuing more narrow Labourist policies slightly to the left of where Blair was.
So that old debate within Labour, are we too far to the left or are we not far enough to the left, will re-emerge?
That debate is raging right now in an atmosphere of some bitterness and acrimony.
Do you see them going down that sort of torturous path that he did with Michael Foot was there, and then he was succeeded by a whole lot of Labour? No,
but the Blair and Brown thing is real, because for Labour the issue is always how big do we make the tent? How much of a threat do we pose to it? How hard do we push?
So this is an existential debate that they will have to go through.
Our instinctive tax demands, they're big things.
Adam Roberts, what about Nick Clegg? He is the first Liberal leader to have actually played a role in government for some 50 or 60 years. He made it all the way to being Deputy Prime Ministership. Some who are favourable to him say that he sacrificed his party's political interest to secure the national interest. Is that how history will remember him? Or will they say he made a terrible mistake, he backtracked on important promises like those to do with education, he deceived the electorate and suffered? Which will it be?
Well, I think in terms of what influence he had on policy on the previous government, I think history might be generally a little kinder than those harsh analysis on the university fees and so on. I think by and large the Liberal Democrats had a modifying influence on the previous government, whereas my fear with the next government is that the role of the nutty right that you mentioned before, the extremists within the Conservative Party, will be to pull the new government to do more extreme things without that modifying influence of the Lib Dems. So I suspect it will be defined slightly by what comes next. If the next government is a rather unpleasant government from the point of view of those on the left, then they will rather miss the moderating influence of Nick Clegg and the Lib Dems. From the point of view of the party, of course, Nick Clegg has been an electoral disaster. To have been reduced so low to a handful of MPs, there'll be jokes about, you can put the whole of the party of the Liberal Democrats in a single taxi. This is a disastrous outcome, and politics is a cruel thing, and in the end, leaders are judged by the performance that they deliver. In Indian context, it would be Rahul Gandhi. In the context of the UK, it's Nick Clegg.
What's the future for the Liberal Party, James Lamont? They've been through this sort of patch frequently. They spent the 60s and 70s with just about a handful of MPs, and the joke that Adam Roberts was talking about was current in the 70s as well. Do you see them reviving easily, or will it take them a half century to get back to 50 seats, if they ever do?
I don't think it will be a half century. I think it could. You've seen extraordinary changes in this election. I expect you to see extraordinary changes in the next election. It's obviously a fairly volatile political framework. I don't think they will have 50 years in the wilderness, but they do have a stony road to tread right now. They have to rebuild themselves. They have to recommit themselves to principles. I mean, the whole growth of the Liberal Democrats over the last 20, 30 years is by taking principled stands over policy. Sometimes they've been to the left of Labour, and they've been imaginative policy makers. They've also been internationalists, and I think they've captured a vote of people who didn't feel comfortable with Labour or with the Conservatives. They've kind of fallen between two kind of big poles here in a kind of a sort of no man's land, and coalition government in terms of their electoral fortunes has not helped them. I think they'll get back because there is a tradition of liberalism, and it will depend on what happens over some of these existential issues that we've been talking about in the next government.
Very quickly, George Brock, because we're running out of time, what sort of cabinet do you expect David Cameron to now come up with? And what role do you expect for George Osborne? He was a very successful Chancellor who, perhaps even to his own party's surprise, overcame the enormous economic challenge he had to take on. Will he continue as Chancellor, or is there some other job now that he might want?
Well, I would have thought that Osborne, who is, as you say, stands in very good credit with Cameron and is a very, very close political ally of his, is the one member of the cabinet who can really choose his next job. If he wants to stay as Chancellor, I imagine he could. If he wants to be Foreign Secretary, which I assume to be the other thing that he might wish to be before trying to lead the party in succession to Cameron, then I suppose he could probably become Foreign Secretary. I would guess that the other thing that Cameron will do is try to take the opportunity offered by having a very free hand in his cabinet to bring on the younger generation. One of the complications of living in a coalition is that you have to divide the cabinet posts between two parties, even if it's not a 50-50 split, and that gives you fewer opportunities to both place people you want to advance in the cabinet. It just limits your opportunity. You've got a bigger and better opportunity now to bring on a younger generation. I would imagine that he will do that. And going back to one of the earlier questions you asked, Karen, I would have thought that you could expect to see, at least among the junior ministers, one or two of those potential troublemakers on the right who he will try to neutralise by putting them on the government payroll.
Absolutely. He's got a lot more jobs to offer and to throw around as sweeties in their direction. One last question, and I want to focus on Boris Johnson. He's often been talked of as a potential successor, sometimes even as a potential challenger to Mr. Cameron. He's now an MP as well as Mayor of London. Do you see him joining the cabinet? Do you see him posing any challenge politically to Mr. Cameron over the next 5 years?
Well, I certainly don't see him posing a challenge in the immediate. He may well have been hoping to do so, but I really don't see any prospect of him doing so. And you can't really tell what's going to happen because, you know, things can unravel, as you said. There can be problems, people can die, the by-elections lost, all those sort of things can happen with such a small majority. But I wouldn't be like to be asked to forecast whether they will happen and whether they'll go Boris's way or not.
Do you think David Cameron has actually thought about some legislative measures that he wants to introduce pretty quickly, or has he simply spent so much time campaigning and worrying about the polls that were predicting he might not win that he hasn't actually got an agenda in hand because he hadn't anticipated he'd have a majority government?
God knows, I don't know what's going on in David Cameron's head. I imagine more than anything else he's just feeling an overwhelming sense of relief and triumph at a victory that nobody expected he would have, and certainly not on this scale.
Let me very quickly put that to you, George Brock. Do you think David Cameron is prepared with an agenda that he's going to start implementing immediately? Or was he so caught up with the campaign and the fear that he wasn't going to win that he hasn't actually ever begun to even think of what he'd do if he had an outright majority, which he now does?
I think there's a very simple reason why he will at the very least have one or two things written out on the back of an envelope, which is that he must at least have believed it possible, even if he had some confidence in the result that actually happened. He must have believed it was possible that they were going to have to go into coalition negotiations with somebody. If you think coalition negotiations are going to happen, then you really need to be very clear in your own head about what you want and what the order of priorities is. So my guess is he'll have a fair idea about what he's about to do.
All right, gentlemen, let's leave it there. My thanks to all my guests for joining me. And if you have been, thanks for watching. Goodbye. Good night.
Rather than separatism. But I wouldn't be surprised with a Scottish election coming up in 2016 that we don't see a second referendum, back in the manifesto. One of the big challenges that David Cameron now has, he'll have a day of self-satisfaction today, but there's some fairly existential questions he now has to grapple with. One is keeping the union together, and the balance of power in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. But also the UK's relationship with Europe, because part of his manifesto was pledging a referendum on the UK's EU membership.
James has given us an encyclopedic answer that's actually touched on many things that I want to raise one by one later on. Let me for a moment focus a little bit more on what Nicola Sturgeon called the tectonic shift that's happened in Scotland. I noticed that in some constituencies like Glasgow, the SNP actually saw a 39% swing in its favour, which is almost unprecedented, and they've had turnouts of up to 75%. Would you accept that this means that the parties hold?
It was the fear that Labour, although they said they wouldn't, Miliband categorically said he would not ally with the Scottish Nationalists, there was a fear, obviously, that he would do.
James Lamont, when he won, Alex Salmond, the Scottish National Party leader, said that the Scottish lion had roared in Scotland. What did that roar feel like to people in England and Wales?
Well, essentially what you have in Scotland now is a nationalist monopoly, and it is an extraordinary story, this sort of spectacular rise of the SNP taking almost all the seats in Scotland. I mean, it is a really seismic change north of the border. I think that we're yet to see what the roar sounds like, but I think that in terms of the voting intentions in Scotland, Scots were not voting for independence or necessarily for another referendum, and Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon have made that clear in their statements over the last few days. However, what they are voting for is legislation and Scottish interests.
Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. The results of the British election have come in, and it's a surprising outcome. The polls have been proved wrong. Labour has suffered serious setbacks. The Scottish Nationalists have swept Scotland. But most surprisingly of all, the Tories have a majority of their own. Over the next 1 hour, we shall analyse what this result means for David Cameron, Ed Miliband and Nick Clegg, what sort of government Mr Cameron will form, and what sort of relationship the Tories will have with Scotland. I have with me a special panel of guests, and together we shall answer all the key questions that could come to your mind. And now joining me to discuss and analyse the British election results is the former head of the BBC in India, Sir Mark Tully, the South Asia Chief of Bureau of The Economist, Adam Roberts, the South Asia Editor of The Telegraph, Dean Nelson, and joining us from London, the Managing Editor of The Financial Times, James Lamont, and Professor of Journalism and former Saturday Editor of The Times, George Brock. Adam Roberts.
Murphy, the leader of the Labour Party in Scotland, who lost his seat in the wipeout, said that Labour had been hit by two nationalisms, by which he meant Scottish nationalism and English nationalism. Now, whether they'd really been hit by English nationalism is a bit debatable, but it is absolutely without dispute that they were crushed by a new version, if you like, of Scottish nationalism, yes.
So, Mark, would you say that the Conservative campaign that said that a Labour-SNP alliance will be an alliance between a party that wants to break the country and another party that wants to break the bank eventually resonated, or at least frightened, the voters south of the border?
Well, I think both those issues were obviously ones which played more than people had analysed. The idea that the economy was on the way up at last, that it had been reasonably well managed by the Conservatives, and that the Labour would go back to what many people see as the dark days of Gordon Brown, last Gordon Brown, and the last days of Tony Blair. So that was one side of it, and also, of course, as you say the other side.
Last night the polls predicted almost uniformly that the Tories and Labour were coming in with a dead heat, and the Tories wouldn't get more than 280 or 290 seats. Today, the Conservatives have a small majority of their own, and they've done significantly better than 2010. So would it be right to say that whatever else this election may be, it is a victory for David Cameron and the Conservatives?
It's a loss for the opinion polls, for the people who try to predict with great confidence what the outcome would be. It was a commonplace thing to say before the election that we'd have to have a coalition government in Britain, and instead, quite remarkably, the Conservatives have come back with a small but probably workable majority. David Cameron must be delighted. His authority is enhanced. He's a very, very lucky man. A man who ran a campaign that was not seen to be tremendously successful or effective, and yet he's come back with a remarkably good result.
George Brock, to what extent was Labour hit by a double Scottish whammy? They were wiped out north of the border by the Scottish Nationalist Party, and in England and Wales, fear that they could ally with the SNP led to them losing rather than gaining seats. Would you agree with that analysis?
Yes, I think it is right. Jim